I was driving home from work on a Tuesday evening in Scottsdale, Arizona, when I noticed the black SUV behind me with flashing red and blue lights mounted on the dashboard. My first instinct was to pull over, but something felt off. The vehicle looked nothing like the marked police cruisers I was used to seeing around town, and my father's words from years ago echoed in my mind. Never stop for unmarked vehicles in isolated areas. I kept driving at a steady pace, turned on my hazard lights to acknowledge I saw them, and made a mental note of every turn I was taking. The SUV stayed on my tail, lights still flashing, and I could see two figures inside gesturing at me to pull over. My heart was pounding, but I was only 3 miles from the Scottsdale Police Department on Civic Center Plaza, and I was determined to make it there before stopping for anyone. The whole situation felt wrong from the start. Real police officers would have used their loudspeaker to give instructions, or they would have called for backup if they thought I was fleeing. Instead, these people just followed me in silence, their cheap-looking light bar bouncing slightly as we drove over speed bumps. I had lived in the Silverstone Heights subdivision for 2 years now, and while I knew our HOA was strict, this was a new level of crazy even for them. The neighborhood had been getting more controlling over the past 6 months, ever since Patricia Vanderhoff took over as HOA president. She was the epitome of a middle-aged neighborhood tyrant, complete with the blonde, highlighted bob haircut and an addiction to filing violations for every tiny infraction she could imagine. I grabbed my phone from the cup holder and called 911 while keeping my eyes on the road. The dispatcher answered on the second ring, and I explained my situation as calmly as I could manage while my hands were shaking. I told her about the unmarked SUV with dashboard lights following me, that I did not feel safe pulling over, and that I was heading directly to the police station. She confirmed my location, told me to keep driving safely, and said she would alert the officers at the station to expect me. The reassurance in her voice helped steady my nerves, but I still felt like I was in some kind of surreal nightmare. What kind of people put police lights on their personal vehicles and try to pull over residents? The streets of Scottsdale were busy with evening traffic, which made me feel slightly safer. At least there were witnesses around if anything went wrong. I merged onto Scottsdale Road, staying in the right lane and maintaining exactly the speed limit. The SUV behind me matched my every move, never backing off, never attempting to go around me. Through my rearview mirror, I could see the driver was a man with a shaved head wearing what looked like a dark uniform shirt, and the passenger appeared to be a woman with short blonde hair. My stomach dropped when I realized the woman looked exactly like Patricia Vanderhoff. What on earth was the HOA president doing in a fake police vehicle trying to pull me over? The traffic light ahead turned yellow and I slowed to a stop. The SUV pulled up close behind me, so close I could barely see their headlights. I kept both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen and stared straight ahead, my phone still connected to 911 on speaker. The dispatcher asked if I was okay, and I confirmed I was stopped at a red light on Scottsdale Road near Chaparral. She told me the police station was less than 2 miles ahead and that officers were standing by. The light felt like it lasted an eternity. I half expected the people behind me to get out and approach my car, but they stayed inside their vehicle. When the light finally turned green, I accelerated smoothly and continued toward the station. My mind raced with questions. Why would the HOA president be involved in pulling people over? What possible authority did she think she had? I knew Patricia was power-hungry and had made life miserable for several residents with her constant violation notices and fines, but this crossed a line into criminal behavior. Impersonating law enforcement was a serious crime in Arizona, and I was not about to let this slide. I had dealt with Patricia's nonsense before when she sent me a violation notice because my trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after pickup. I had dealt with her when she demanded I repaint my front door because the shade of gray I had chosen was not on the pre-approved color list, but this was beyond harassment. This was dangerous. As I turned onto Civic Center Plaza, I could see the Scottsdale Police Department building ahead, its American and Arizona flags visible out front. Relief flooded through me. 2 police cruisers were parked near the entrance with their lights on, and I could see several officers standing outside waiting. I pulled into the parking lot slowly, parked in a visitor spot, and put my car in park. The black SUV that had been following me pulled in as well, but stopped near the entrance, the occupants apparently realizing they had followed me straight to the police station. I thanked the dispatcher, ended the call, and took a deep breath before opening my door. 4 uniformed officers approached my vehicle first, and one of them, a tall man with gray hair and sergeant stripes on his sleeve, asked if I was the person who had called 911. I confirmed I was and pointed to the black SUV that was now sitting idle about 50 feet away. The officers looked at the vehicle, then back at me, and the sergeant asked me to step out and explain what had happened. I told them everything, how the unmarked SUV had pulled up behind me with flashing lights, how I did not feel safe stopping on the road, and how I had driven straight here while on the phone with dispatch. I also mentioned that I believed the driver and passenger were associated with my HOA, and that the passenger looked exactly like Patricia Vanderhoff, our HOA president. The sergeant's expression shifted from concerned to incredulous. He asked me to repeat the part about the HOA president, and I explained who Patricia was and how she had been escalating her enforcement tactics over the past months. Another officer, a younger woman with her hair pulled back in a tight bun, walked toward the black SUV with her hand resting on her duty belt. I watched as she approached the driver's side window, and I could see the window roll down. She spoke to the occupants for a moment, then gestured for them to exit the vehicle. The driver, a stocky man in his 40s wearing a black polo shirt with some kind of security company logo, stepped out first. Then Patricia Vanderhoff herself emerged from the passenger seat, her face red and her mouth already moving in what I assumed were protests and explanations. 2 more officers joined their colleague at the SUV, and I could hear raised voices even from where I stood. Patricia was gesturing wildly, pointing at me, then at her vehicle, then back at the officers. The sergeant asked me to wait by my car while they sorted out the situation, and I leaned against my driver's door, watching the scene unfold. My hands had stopped shaking, replaced now by a growing anger. How dare they try to intimidate me with fake authority? How dare they put lights on their vehicle and play cop? I pulled out my phone and started recording video, making sure to capture the SUV, the fake light bar on the dashboard, and Patricia arguing with the officers. After about 10 minutes, the sergeant walked back to me while his colleagues continued dealing with Patricia and her companion. He asked me detailed questions about what had happened, how long they had followed me, whether they had used a siren or loudspeaker, and if they had tried to stop me before I called 911. I answered everything as clearly as I could remember, checking the timestamps on my dash cam footage that I realized I should have mentioned sooner. When I told him about the dash cam, his eyes lit up and he asked if I could provide that footage. I immediately opened my dash cam app on my phone and showed him the live playback of the last 20 minutes, which clearly showed the SUV following me with its lights flashing and my hazard lights on as I drove to the station. The sergeant watched the footage intently, occasionally asking me to rewind certain sections. When he saw the part where the SUV pulled up inches from my bumper at the red light, He shook his head in disbelief. He asked if I could send him that footage, and I told him I could email it or transfer it to a USB drive right there since I kept a spare in my glove compartment. He opted for the email, gave me his official contact information, and I sent the footage immediately from my phone. He thanked me and said this evidence was crucial for what was likely going to turn into a serious criminal investigation. From what I could overhear of the conversation at the SUV, Patricia was claiming they had every right to conduct security stops on behalf of the HOA, and that they were simply trying to issue me a violation notice for speeding in the neighborhood. The absurdity of her argument was almost funny if it were not so serious. The male driver, who I learned was named Derek Simmons, and ran a private security company that Patricia had hired for the HOA, kept insisting he was a licensed security officer and that his lights were legal. The officers were not buying any of it. I watched as one of them reached into the SUV and examined the light bar on the dashboard, then came back with what looked like a radio or CB transmitter. The female officer walked over to where I stood with the sergeant and introduced herself as Officer Linda Martinez. She asked if I had any previous issues with Patricia Vanderhoff or the HOA that might have led to this incident. I pulled up my email on my phone and showed her the dozens of violation notices I had received over the past year. Most of them were for minor things like parking my car on the street overnight when I had guests, leaving my garage door open for more than 30 minutes while I worked on a project, or having decorative lights up 2 days past the HOA's specified removal date after Christmas. Officer Martinez scrolled through the emails, her eyebrows raising higher with each one she read. She asked if other residents had similar experiences, and I told her about my neighbor Tom Chen, who had received a violation notice because his lawn was a 1/4 inch shorter than the required minimum height. I mentioned the Johnsons 3 houses down who got fined because their teenage son's car leaked a small oil spot on their driveway. I told her about elderly Mrs. Rodriguez, who received a notice because her mailbox had a small scratch on it that needed immediate repair. Officer Martinez made notes of everything I said and asked if I thought any of these residents would be willing to provide statements. I assured her they would be thrilled to finally have someone take their complaints seriously. The sergeant returned to Patricia and Derek, and I could hear him informing them that they were both being detained for investigation of impersonating law enforcement officers, unlawful use of emergency vehicle lights, and harassment. Patricia's voice reached a shrill pitch as she insisted she had done nothing wrong and that, as HOA president, she had the authority to enforce neighborhood rules by any means necessary. The sergeant calmly explained that no, she absolutely did not have that authority, and that HOA regulations did not supersede state and federal laws. Derek tried to argue that his security license gave him certain powers, but the officers quickly shut that down by pointing out that even licensed security officers cannot use red and blue lights to conduct traffic stops. I watched as both Patricia and Derek were handcuffed and placed in separate police cruisers. Patricia was still yelling about lawsuits and calling her attorney, while Derek had gone quiet, apparently realizing the severity of his situation. Officer Martinez came back to me and explained that I would need to come inside the station to give a formal statement, and that a detective would likely want to speak with me as well. She also mentioned that they would be seizing the black SUV as evidence, and that I should document any damage to my vehicle or any other evidence from the incident. I walked around my car but did not see any damage, just the lingering adrenaline and disbelief at what had just happened. Inside the police station, I was led to a quiet interview room where I gave my full statement to Detective James Brookshire, a man in his 50s with a weathered face and kind eyes. He listened patiently as I recounted the entire incident again, occasionally asking clarifying questions about times, locations, and specific details about Patricia's behavior toward me and other residents. I showed him my phone with all the HOA violation notices, and he took photos of each one for the case file. He explained that impersonating law enforcement was a Class 6 felony in Arizona, and the use of emergency lights on a non-emergency vehicle was another serious charge. Combined with potential harassment and stalking charges, Patricia and Derek were facing significant legal consequences. Detective Brookshire asked me about the HOA's structure and who else might be involved in this operation. I explained that Patricia was the president, but there was also a vice president named George Hartman and a secretary named Linda Sue Morrison. I did not know if they were aware of Patricia's fake traffic stop scheme, but I knew they were all part of the increasingly aggressive enforcement tactics the HOA had adopted. The detective made notes and said he would be investigating the entire HOA board to determine if this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern of abuse. After giving my statement, I was allowed to leave, but Detective Brookshire asked me to keep my phone available in case he had follow-up questions. He also advised me to document any retaliation or further harassment from the HOA, and to call immediately if anyone else tried to pull me over or intimidate me. I drove home in the growing darkness, my mind still processing everything that had happened in the span of less than 2 hours. My quiet Tuesday evening commute had turned into a police investigation involving my HOA president being arrested for impersonating a cop. I could not wait to tell my wife, Sarah, what had happened. Though I knew she would be both relieved, I was safe and furious that Patricia had escalated to such dangerous behavior. When I pulled into my driveway in Silverstone Heights, I noticed several neighbors were outside, and a few of them started walking toward my house as soon as they saw me. Tom Chen from next door reached me first, his face full of concern. He asked if I was okay and said that some woman from the HOA board had been calling residents asking if anyone knew where I was. I told Tom and the other gathering neighbors about what had just happened, and their reactions ranged from shock to grim satisfaction that Patricia had finally gone too far. Mrs. Rodriguez clutched her chest and said she had always known that woman was dangerous. The Johnsons said they wanted to file complaints too if it would help the case against Patricia. Sarah came out of the house, having heard the commotion, and I gave her a quick hug before explaining the whole incident again to the growing crowd of neighbors. By the time I finished, there were at least 15 people standing in my driveway and front yard, all sharing their own horror stories about Patricia and the HOA board. Tom mentioned that just last week, Patricia had threatened to fine him $500 for leaving his trash cans out on a Tuesday instead of taking them in Monday night, even though he had been at the emergency room with his daughter who had broken her arm. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about how Patricia had sent her a notice requiring her to replace her perfectly good front door because it was not the right shade of beige according to some new color chart the board had approved without telling residents. I gave everyone Detective Brookshire's card and encouraged them to reach out to him with their own experiences. I explained that the detective was investigating whether this was a pattern of behavior from the HOA board, and that their statements could help build a case. Several neighbors pulled out their phones right there and started calling the number on the card, eager to finally have their grievances heard by someone with actual authority. It felt good to see the community coming together against Patricia's tyranny, even if it had taken something as extreme as fake police lights to trigger the response. The next morning, I woke up to find my phone flooded with messages from neighbors and even some local news outlets. Apparently, word had spread quickly about the incident, and the story of an HOA president being arrested for impersonating law enforcement was too juicy for the local media to ignore. I ignored the media requests, not wanting to turn this into a circus, but I did respond to my neighbors who were asking for updates. I told them that Patricia and Derek had been released on bond late last night, but that the charges were proceeding and a court date would be set soon. I also noticed that I had received an email from the HOA attorney, a man named Richard Caldwell who worked for a firm in Phoenix. The email was carefully worded, but essentially stated that the HOA board was suspending Patricia Vanderhoff from her duties as president pending an internal investigation, and that the board did not condone her actions. The email also stated that any violation notices issued by Patricia in the past 6 months were being reviewed, and that residents could appeal any fines they believed were unjust. I forwarded the email to Detective Brookshire and to all the neighbors who had been complaining about Patricia's enforcement tactics. Over the next few days, the investigation expanded significantly. Detective Brookshire contacted me twice with follow-up questions, and he mentioned that they had interviewed over 30 residents from Silverstone Heights, all of whom had similar stories about Patricia's aggressive behavior. The detective also revealed that when they searched the black SUV and Derek Simmons's security company office, they found documents suggesting Patricia had paid Derek over $15,000 from HOA funds to conduct surveillance and enforcement patrols in the neighborhood. This raised questions about misappropriation of HOA funds, which was a whole separate legal issue that could result in civil lawsuits from the residents. The local news finally got hold of enough information to run a story, and I watched on Channel 3 News as they reported on the HOA president arrested for impersonating officer case. They interviewed a legal expert who explained that HOA boards have limited authority over residents and absolutely no authority to conduct traffic stops or use emergency vehicle lights. The expert also mentioned that residents who feel their HOA is overstepping can take legal action or even dissolve the HOA board through proper procedures. The news segment ended with a reporter standing outside the Silverstone Heights entrance sign, describing our neighborhood as a community that had been under siege from its own leadership. The attention from the news story brought even more complaints to light. Residents from the neighborhood started a Facebook group called Silverstone Heights HOA Accountability, where people shared their violation notices. Photos of Derek's SUV patrolling the streets at odd hours, and copies of suspicious budget reports showing where HOA dues were being spent. It turned out that Patricia had approved multiple expenditures without proper board votes, including the $15,000 to Derek's security company, another $8,000 for administrative consulting that went to her own side business, and $5,000 for legal research that no one could account for. The more we dug into the finances, the worse it looked for Patricia and potentially for the other board members who had signed off on these expenditures. George Hartman, the vice president, resigned from the board within a week of Patricia's arrest. He released a statement saying he had not been aware of the traffic stop incident or the unauthorized expenditures, and that he could not in good conscience continue serving on a board that had lost the trust of the community. Linda Sue Morrison, the secretary, also stepped down but not before releasing all the board meeting minutes from the past year. Those minutes showed that Patricia had dominated every meeting, often making decisions without votes, and that both George and Linda Sue had raised concerns multiple times that were dismissed or ignored. Detective Brookshire called me on a Friday afternoon, about 2 weeks after the initial incident, to let me know that additional charges were being filed against Patricia. In addition to the impersonating law enforcement charges, she was now facing charges for theft, fraud, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Derek Simmons was also facing additional charges related to operating a security business without proper licenses for the services he was providing. The detective thanked me again for my quick thinking in driving to the police station instead of pulling over, saying that my dash cam footage and 911 call had been crucial in building the case. I asked Detective Brookshire what would happen next, and he explained that both Patricia and Derek would have arraignment hearings within the next month, where they would enter pleas, and the judge would determine if there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. He expected both cases to move forward based on the overwhelming evidence they had collected. He also mentioned that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office was considering whether to file charges against other former board members if evidence showed they had knowingly participated in the financial misconduct. The HOA attorney Richard Caldwell reached out to me directly and asked if I would be willing to serve on an interim board to oversee the neighborhood while new elections were organized. I was hesitant at first, given all the drama, but several neighbors encouraged me to do it, saying they trusted me to help restore sanity to the HOA. I agreed on the condition that the interim board would focus solely on basic maintenance and safety issues, that all financial expenditures would be transparent and approved by majority vote, and that we would schedule new elections within 90 days. Richard agreed to those terms, and I found myself reluctantly serving as interim HOA president alongside Tom Chen as vice president and Mrs. Rodriguez as secretary. Our first act as the interim board was to cancel all outstanding violation notices issued by Patricia over the past year, unless they involved genuine safety hazards. We refunded fines that had been paid for petty violations like trash, contiming, or unapproved door colors. We also fired Derek's security company and hired a reputable property management firm to handle routine maintenance and landscape contracts. The response from the neighborhood was overwhelmingly positive. People actually smiled and waved when they saw me now, whereas before, everyone had walked on eggshells afraid of getting another violation notice. The arraignment hearing for Patricia Vanderhoff took place on a Tuesday morning at the Scottsdale City Court. I took the morning off work to attend, along with about 20 other residents from Silverstone Heights. We filled several rows in the courtroom, a visible reminder to Patricia that her actions had affected real people. Patricia walked in wearing a conservative navy blue suit, her blonde bob freshly styled, and her lawyer, an expensive-looking man in a gray suit, at her side. She did not look at any of us in the gallery, keeping her eyes forward as she stood before Judge Catherine Sullivan. The prosecutor, an assistant county attorney named Michael Torres, read the charges. 2 counts of impersonating a peace officer, 1 count of unlawful use of emergency vehicle lights, 3 counts of theft, 2 counts of fraud, and 5 counts of misappropriation of funds. Patricia pleaded not guilty to all charges, and her attorney immediately launched into a request for dismissal, arguing that the charges were overblown and that Patricia had been acting in good faith to enforce HOA regulations. Judge Sullivan was not impressed. She denied the motion to dismiss and set a trial date for 3 months out. She also maintained Patricia's bond conditions, which included a prohibition on contacting any Silverstone Heights residents and a ban on serving in any HOA leadership position. Derek Simmons had his arraignment the same day, and his outcome was similar. He pleaded not guilty to impersonating a peace officer, unlawful use of emergency vehicle lights, and operating a security business without proper licensing. His attorney tried to argue that Derek had reasonably believed his actions were legal based on Patricia's representations, but the judge was not buying it. Derek's trial was scheduled for around the same time as Patricia's, and the prosecution indicated they might try the cases together since the charges stemmed from the same incident. As the weeks passed and we approached the trial dates, life in Silverstone Heights started to feel normal again. The interim board handled routine business without drama, Residents stopped being afraid of their own HOA, and property values actually started to recover from the hit they had taken when word got out about Patricia's reign of terror. Real estate agents had told us that several potential buyers had backed out of purchases in our neighborhood specifically because of online reviews mentioning the aggressive HOA. Now, with new leadership and the promise of reformed governance, those concerns were fading. I was subpoenaed to testify at Patricia's trial, which finally began on a Monday morning in late spring. The courtroom was packed with residents, media, and legal observers interested in what had become a somewhat high-profile case about HOA overreach. The prosecutor, Michael Torres, gave an opening statement that outlined the charges and explained how Patricia had abused her position of trust in the community to enrich herself and harass residents who questioned her authority. He described the fake traffic stop as the culmination of months of escalating intimidation tactics designed to silence opposition. Patricia's defense attorney, William Bradford, gave his opening statement next. He portrayed Patricia as a dedicated community volunteer who had been trying her best to maintain property values and neighborhood standards. He claimed that any financial irregularities were simple accounting mistakes, not intentional theft, and that the traffic stop incident was a misunderstanding where Patricia had simply wanted to deliver a violation notice to me and had not realized that using Derek's vehicle with lights would be illegal. It was a weak defense, and I could see several jurors looking skeptical even during the opening statement. I was called to testify on the second day of the trial. I walked to the witness stand, placed my hand on the Bible, and swore to tell the truth. Michael Torres led me through my testimony, starting with how long I had lived in Silverstone Heights and my initial experiences with the HOA. I described receiving violation notices for increasingly minor issues, the escalating fines, and the general atmosphere of fear that Patricia had created in the neighborhood. Then we got to the evening of the incident. I described seeing the unmarked SUV with flashing lights, my decision to drive to the police station instead of pulling over, my 911 call, and the dash cam footage that had captured everything. The prosecutor played the dash cam footage for the jury on a large screen in the courtroom. I watched along with everyone else as the 20-minute video showed the black SUV following my car with its lights flashing, pulling up inches from my bumper at the red light, and then following me all the way to the police station parking lot. You could hear my voice on the 911 call staying calm but clearly concerned, and you could see my hazard lights blinking the entire time to show I was aware of the vehicle behind me. When the video showed Patricia and Derek getting out of the SUV at the police station and being confronted by officers, several jurors leaned forward in their seats. William Bradford cross-examined me, trying to suggest that I had been speeding in the neighborhood and that Patricia had legitimate grounds to try to stop me. I calmly explained that I had not been speeding, that even if I had been, the HOA had no authority to conduct traffic stops, and that using fake police lights was illegal regardless of the justification. He tried to paint me as a difficult resident who refused to follow HOA rules, but I simply pulled out my phone and showed the jury the list of violation notices I had received for things, like leaving my garage door open and having Christmas lights up an extra day. The jury did not look sympathetic to Bradford's argument. Other residents testified over the next few days, describing their own experiences with Patricia's enforcement tactics and the fear they felt living under her leadership. Tom Chen testified about being threatened with fines while his daughter was in the emergency room. Mrs. Rodriguez testified about the violation notice for a scratched mailbox and how Patricia had threatened to put a lien on her house if she did not pay the fine immediately. The Johnsons testified about the oil stain violation and how Derek had taken photos of their driveway at 6 in the morning without permission. Each testimony painted a picture of an HOA president who had gone far beyond reasonable enforcement and had created an environment of harassment and intimidation. The prosecution also called a forensic accountant who had reviewed the HOA's financial records. She testified that Patricia had authorized payments totaling over $30,000 to various vendors and consultants without proper board approval, and that at least $15,000 of those dollars had gone to Derek's security company for services that were not properly documented. Another $8,000 had gone to a consulting company that turned out to be owned by Patricia's husband. The accountant testified that these expenditures violated the HOA's bylaws and Arizona state law governing HOA finances. Derek Simmons was also called as a witness by the prosecution after accepting a plea deal. He testified that Patricia had hired him specifically to conduct surveillance on certain residents she considered troublemakers, including me. He said she had asked him to find ways to catch people violating HOA rules, and had suggested that having lights on his vehicle would make residents more likely to comply with his instructions. Derek admitted that he knew using red and blue lights was illegal, but said Patricia had convinced him that HOA enforcement was a special category that might be allowed. His testimony was damaging to Patricia's defense, especially when he produced text messages from Patricia explicitly instructing him to pull over certain residents to have a conversation about their violations. Patricia herself took the stand in her own defense, which many legal observers thought was a mistake. She testified that she had only been trying to maintain the neighborhood's standards and property values. She claimed that residents had become lax about following rules and that stricter enforcement was necessary. When asked about the financial irregularities, she insisted they were accounting errors and that she had always intended to have the expenditures ratified by the board retroactively. When asked about the fake traffic stop, she claimed she had just wanted to talk to me and did not realize that Derek's lights would be a problem. Her testimony came across as defensive and entitled, and she made things worse by becoming argumentative with the prosecutor during cross-examination. Michael Torres confronted Patricia with her text messages to Derek, where she had explicitly used phrases like "pull him over" and "make sure he stops this time." He asked her how those messages could be interpreted as anything other than instructing Derek to impersonate law enforcement. Patricia tried to claim she had just meant to stop me in a general sense, not to conduct a traffic stop, but her explanation was not convincing. Torres also confronted her with the financial records showing the unauthorized payments, and Patricia's explanations became increasingly convoluted and defensive. By the time she stepped down from the witness stand, it was clear her testimony had hurt rather than helped her case. The closing arguments took place on a Friday afternoon. Michael Torres summarized the evidence, emphasizing the dash cam footage, the witness testimony, and the financial records. He argued that Patricia had abused her position of trust, had committed multiple felonies in her attempt to control and intimidate residents, and deserved to be held accountable for her actions. William Bradford gave a closing argument that tried to portray Patricia as a flawed but well-intentioned person who had made mistakes in judgment but had not committed crimes. He asked the jury to consider whether Patricia really had criminal intent or whether she had simply been overzealous in her HOA duties. The contrast between the two arguments was stark, and I felt confident that the jury would see through Bradford's attempts to minimize Patricia's actions. The jury deliberated for about 6 hours over 2 days. On Monday afternoon, they returned with their verdict. I was sitting in the courtroom along with Tom, Mrs. Rodriguez, and at least a dozen other Silverstone Heights residents. The foreperson stood and read the verdict. Guilty on both counts of impersonating a peace officer. Guilty on the unlawful use of emergency vehicle lights charge. guilty on all 3 theft counts, guilty on both fraud counts, and guilty on 4 of the 5 misappropriation of funds counts. Patricia's face went white as the verdicts were read, and her attorney put a hand on her shoulder as she swayed slightly in her seat. The residents in the gallery remained quiet, but I could feel the collective sense of relief and vindication. Judge Sullivan set a sentencing hearing for 3 weeks later and remanded Patricia to custody pending sentencing, citing the seriousness of the charges and the number of guilty verdicts. Patricia was handcuffed in the courtroom and led away by bailiffs, and this time she did look back at the gallery, her expression a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. I felt no satisfaction in seeing her led away in handcuffs, just relief that the ordeal was finally over and that she would face consequences for her actions. The sentencing hearing was much quicker than the trial. Patricia's attorney presented character witnesses who testified that she had been a dedicated volunteer in other organizations, and that she had been a good neighbor in her previous community. The defense asked for leniency and probation rather than prison time. The prosecution argued for a significant prison sentence, pointing to the multiple convictions, the abuse of trust, and the impact on dozens of residents. Several residents were allowed to give victim impact statements. Tom Chen talked about the stress Patricia's enforcement had caused his family during a medical emergency. Mrs. Rodriguez talked about how Patricia had made her afraid to even check her own mailbox. I gave a statement describing how the fake traffic stop had made me fear for my safety and had violated my trust in my own community. Judge Sullivan listened to all the statements and then delivered her sentence. She noted that Patricia had been in a position of trust and had systematically abused that trust for personal gain and to intimidate residents. She sentenced Patricia to 3 years in prison on the impersonating a peace officer charges, with additional consecutive time for the theft and fraud charges, resulting in a total sentence of 6 years in Arizona State Prison. Patricia would be eligible for parole after serving 85% of her sentence. The judge also ordered Patricia to pay restitution to the HOA and to the individual residents who had been fined under false pretenses, totaling over $45,000. Patricia broke down crying as the sentence was read, and her attorney indicated they would file an appeal, though legal experts I spoke to later said the appeal was unlikely to succeed given the strength of the evidence. Derek Simmons, who had testified against Patricia as part of his plea deal, received a sentence of 2 years probation, a $10,000 fine, and a permanent prohibition from working in any security or law enforcement-related field. He also had to pay a portion of the restitution to the HOA. Derek stood silently as his sentence was read, looking relieved that he had avoided prison time. Back in Silverstone Heights, we held elections for a new permanent HOA board about a month after Patricia's sentencing. I chose not to run, feeling I had done my duty as interim president and wanting to return to normal life. Tom Chen ran for president and won overwhelmingly. Mrs. Rodriguez remained as secretary, and a new resident named Jennifer Park was elected as vice president. Their first order of business was to completely rewrite the HOA's enforcement policies to emphasize communication and cooperation rather than fines and intimidation. They also implemented transparent financial reporting with monthly statements posted to the neighborhood website and annual audits by an independent accounting firm. The new board also voted to reduce HOA dues by 20% since we no longer needed to pay for unnecessary security patrols or Patricia's consulting fees. That move was hugely popular with residents and helped restore faith in the HOA as an institution meant to serve the community rather than control it. We also updated the HOA bylaws to include term limits for board members, requirements for proper voting on all expenditures over a certain amount, and a formal complaint process for residents who felt they were being treated unfairly. Life in Silverstone Heights gradually returned to normal, though the Patricia Vanderhoff saga became legendary in the neighborhood. New residents moving in would hear the story and express disbelief that an HOA president had actually tried to pull people over with fake police lights. Existing residents would share their own Patricia stories, and we developed a dark sense of humor about the whole situation. Someone even created T-shirts that said, "I survived the Silverstone Heights HOA," with a parody police badge logo, and they became popular at neighborhood barbecues. I never received another violation notice for petty issues. When I accidentally left my trash cans out overnight one week, because I had been traveling for work, I came home to find them neatly placed back in my side yard with a friendly note from Tom saying he had noticed I was out of town and did not want me to worry about it. That gesture perfectly encapsulated the new spirit of the HOA. Neighbors helping neighbors rather than looking for reasons to fine each other. The local media followed up on the story periodically, especially when Patricia's appeal was denied about a year after her conviction. Legal experts used the case as a cautionary tale about HOA overreach and the importance of resident oversight. Several Arizona state legislators even referenced the case when proposing new laws to increase transparency and accountability for HOA boards. One proposed bill would require HOA boards to carry insurance against lawsuits for improper enforcement, and would create a state oversight board to handle complaints against HOAs. While that legislation had not passed yet as of my last knowledge, the Patricia Vanderhoff case had definitely put HOA reform on the radar of state lawmakers. I occasionally thought about Patricia and wondered how she was adjusting to prison life. It was hard to imagine someone who had been so obsessed with neighborhood rules and control now living in a highly regulated environment where she had no power at all. I did not take any pleasure in her imprisonment, but I also did not feel guilty about my role in her conviction. She had made choices that endangered people and violated the law, and she was facing the consequences of those choices. If I had pulled over that night instead of driving to the police station, who knows what would have happened? Patricia and Derek might have tried to intimidate me further, or they might have escalated their fake police operation to even more dangerous levels. My wife Sarah and I talked about the whole experience many times over the following months. She said she was proud of me for staying calm during the fake traffic stop, and for making the smart decision to drive to the police station instead of pulling over. She also said she was glad I had agreed to serve on the interim board to help restore order to the neighborhood, even though I had been reluctant at first. I told her that the whole experience had taught me the importance of standing up to bullies, even when they have official-sounding titles and claim to have authority. Patricia had counted on residents being too intimidated to challenge her, and for a long time her strategy had worked. But once someone finally stood up to her and exposed her illegal behavior, her house of cards collapsed quickly. The restitution payments from Patricia started arriving about 18 months after her conviction. The HOA received a check for $15,000, which we used to replenish the reserve fund that Patricia had depleted. Individual residents who had paid improper fines received checks ranging from $200 to over $1,000 depending on how much they had been forced to pay. Mrs. Rodriguez used her restitution check to finally repair her mailbox properly and to plant new flowers in her front yard. Tom used his to take his family on a weekend trip to San Diego, saying they deserved a vacation after all the stress Patricia had caused. I received about $800 in restitution for the various fines I had paid over the years, and I donated it to a local organization that provided legal assistance to residents dealing with HOA disputes. Derek Simmons moved out of Arizona entirely after completing his probation. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that he had relocated to Nevada and was working in retail, unable to return to security work due to his criminal record. His security company went out of business within months of his conviction, and several of his former clients sued him for breach of contract and fraud. I felt no sympathy for Derek. He had been a willing participant in Patricia's schemes, and while he had cooperated with prosecutors, he had still made choices that endangered people and violated the law. About 2 years after the initial incident, I was driving home from work on a Tuesday evening, almost the same time of day as when the fake traffic stop had happened. I was on the same stretch of Scottsdale Road when I saw flashing lights behind me. For a split second, my heart rate spiked, and I felt the same anxiety I had felt that night with Patricia and Derek. But then I looked in my rearview mirror and saw a clearly marked Scottsdale police cruiser with a uniformed officer visible inside. I pulled over safely into a parking lot, rolled down my window, and waited for the officer to approach. He informed me that my registration tag had expired, which I had completely forgotten about. He checked my license and insurance, gave me a warning, and told me to get it renewed within the week. I thanked him and drove home, amused at the contrast between this legitimate traffic stop and the fake one that had started the whole Patricia Vanderhoff saga. I renewed my registration the next day and realized that I no longer felt anxious about authority figures or police officers. The fake traffic stop had created a temporary fear response, but going through the legal process and seeing the system work properly had restored my faith in legitimate law enforcement. The officers who had responded to the police station that night had been professional, thorough, and genuinely concerned about my safety. Detective Brookshire had conducted a comprehensive investigation and built a solid case. The prosecutors had presented the evidence effectively. The judge had been fair but firm in sentencing. The system had worked the way it was supposed to work, and that gave me confidence that justice could still prevail when people stood up for themselves. The Silverstone Heights HOA continued to function smoothly under Tom's leadership. We had no more scandals, no more aggressive enforcement, and no more residents living in fear of their own neighborhood association. Property values recovered and even increased, as word spread that the HOA was under new, reasonable management. Real estate agents started using reformed HOA with new leadership as a selling point for homes in our subdivision. Several residents who had been considering moving specifically because of Patricia decided to stay and enjoy the improved community atmosphere. I ran into Richard Caldwell, the HOA attorney, at a neighborhood event about 3 years after the incident. He told me that the Patricia Vanderhoff case had become a teaching example in his law firm for how not to run an HOA. He said they now included specific warnings about staying within legal boundaries and respecting resident rights in all their training materials for new HOA boards. He also mentioned that several other neighborhoods had reached out to him after hearing about our case, concerned that their own HOA boards might be engaging in questionable practices. Richard said he had probably conducted a dozen audits of other HOAs in the Phoenix area, finding and correcting problems before they escalated to Patricia-level criminality. Looking back on the whole experience, I realized that the scariest moment was not actually during the fake traffic stop itself, but in the hours and days afterward when I understood how close I had come to a much worse outcome. If I had pulled over on a dark side street, Patricia and Derek might have become aggressive or threatening. If I had not had a dash cam recording everything, it might have been my word against theirs about what happened. If the police had not taken my report seriously, Patricia might have continued her intimidation campaign against other residents. So many things could have gone wrong, but they did not, and I was grateful for that. The one question people always asked me was whether I regretted moving to a neighborhood with an HOA. My answer was always the same. No, I did not regret it, because HOAs themselves are not inherently bad. They serve important functions like maintaining common areas, enforcing reasonable standards that protect property values, and providing a framework for community cooperation. The problem was not the HOA as an institution, but the specific person who had abused the power of that institution. Patricia Vanderhoff was the problem, not the concept of an HOA. With proper oversight, term limits, transparent finances, and reasonable enforcement, an HOA can be a positive force in a neighborhood. Our community proved that by recovering from Patricia's reign and establishing a healthier model of governance. I also reflected on the importance of that split-second decision I made to keep driving instead of pulling over. My father had told me years ago, after hearing news stories about criminals using fake police lights to target victims, that if I ever felt unsafe during a traffic stop, I should turn on my hazard lights and drive carefully to the nearest police station or well-lit public area. That advice had seemed paranoid at the time, but it had proven crucial. I made sure to pass that same advice on to my own kids as they learned to drive, and I encouraged other parents in the neighborhood to have similar conversations with their families. You never know when a bit of safety advice might save you from a dangerous situation. The whole experience also taught me the value of documentation. My dash cam footage had been crucial evidence in the case against Patricia and Derek. The email records of violation notices had shown the pattern of harassment. The HOA financial records had exposed the theft and fraud. In our digital age, documentation is easier than ever, and it can make the difference between a he-said-she-said dispute and a clear-cut case with objective evidence. I now made sure to document everything important, from car maintenance to home repairs to interactions with any officials or authority figures. It was not about being paranoid, but about being prepared to prove the truth if necessary. As I sat on my back patio one evening about 4 years after the incident, watching the Arizona sunset and listening to the sounds of kids playing in the neighborhood, I felt genuinely content with how everything had turned out. Patricia Vanderhoff was in prison where she belonged, serving time for her crimes. Derek Simmons had been held accountable and banned from the security industry. The HOA was functioning properly under reasonable leadership. The neighborhood had come together and was stronger for having overcome the challenge. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the restoration of a community that had been damaged by one person's abuse of power. I thought about Patricia occasionally, wondering if she had gained any insight during her time in prison about how badly she had handled her authority as HOA president. Did she understand now that her aggressive enforcement tactics had been counterproductive and illegal? Did she regret the choices that led to her conviction? Or did she still see herself as the victim, unfairly punished for trying to maintain neighborhood standards? I would never know the answers to those questions, and ultimately, they did not matter. What mattered was that her ability to harm people had been stopped, and that the community had recovered and moved forward. The story of the fake HOA cops trying to pull me over and my decision to lead them to the police station became part of Silverstone Heights lore, told and retold at neighborhood gatherings and to new residents. Some details probably got exaggerated over time, but the core truth remained the same. An HOA president had gone way too far, a resident had stood up to her by making a smart decision in a tense moment, and the legal system had worked to hold her accountable. It was a story with a satisfying ending, which was not always the case in real life. I was proud to have played a role in bringing Patricia's crimes to light and in helping restore sanity to our neighborhood. As the sun set completely and the streetlights came on, I went inside to have dinner with Sarah. Life was good in Silverstone Heights again. The nightmare of Patricia Vanderhoff's fake police operation was behind us, and our community had emerged stronger and more united. I never imagined when I bought a house in an HOA neighborhood that I would end up at the center of a criminal case involving impersonation of law enforcement. But life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges at you. What matters is how you respond to those challenges, and I was satisfied that I had responded correctly by staying calm, protecting myself, and letting the legal system do its job. The fake HOA cops had tried to intimidate me, but instead, they had driven themselves straight into accountability and justice.